Welcome to session 11B of the Textile Society of America's Symposium online this year. Good afternoon to people in North America, and good day to everyone else, or hopefully it's not too late in the evening wherever you are. I am Melinda Watt. I am the Vice President of the Textile Society of America. I'm going to introduce the speakers to you, and we will just do very short introductions with titles. Housekeeping Instructions. We're running this probably very similarly to any other sessions that you have attended. Please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom right of your screen. If you have a question for any of the speakers, you can type that in at any point. We will be saving the questions until the end. Please do specify which speaker, which presenter you would like to answer the question. We can't respond to raised hands, so the Q&A function is really the only way for us to communicate, and we're organizing all of the conversation in that function. So I think that is all the housekeeping. Without further ado, I'm going to get us started, and I'm very pleased to introduce Emily Taylor. The title of her paper is Uncovering Objects, the Importance of Context for the Textiles of Tyninghame House, Scotland, circa 1700 to 1800.
Thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to the Textile Society of America for having me along. So in 1712, Lady Grizzel Bailey went shopping, and among many other purchases, she bought a fine saddle of yellow velvet trimmed with silver for her eldest daughter, Grizzy, who turned 20 that year. Lady Grizzel recorded the item in the personal and household accounts, which she meticulously kept throughout her adult life. Her husband, George Bailey of Mellestane and Jerviswood, happily handed her this task with the proviso, provided I be in no debt. In the collection of National Museum Scotland, there is a side saddle cover in dark yellow silk velvet trimmed with silver. Is this the same saddle cover? Tentatively dated to the mid-18th century, this item was originally acquired by the museum from Tyninghame House in Scotland. Yet Tyninghame was never the home of Lady Grizzel Bailey, which raises the question, can this object have anything to do with the 1712 purchase for Grizzy? Two lines of inquiry are essential to begin answering that question: the context of other objects in the museum's collection and the context of their provenance. A majority of items in National Museum Scotland fashion and textile collection have been acquired as part of object groups, meaning the first step in getting to know an object is to look at the acquisition source and search for any other items that formed that acquisition. Finding the acquisition source and reconfiguring the Tyninghame group has been a long, bumpy, and sometimes uncertain process. In 1977, the group was acquired and split between the Royal Scottish Museum and the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland, only to be reunited when the two museums amalgamated in 1986 to become National Museum Scotland. However, the numbering systems and multiple storage locations of the collections meant that the Tyninghame objects remained disassociated, and research was largely paused after their acquisition until around 2013, when the development of a new permanent gallery for fashion and textiles prompted a collections review. Research for interpretation kept gathering more and more pieces into the group. Single lengths of fabrics became unpicked dresses, and a court mantua found without a number was reassociated. Although the diverse storage requirements of the group mean they are still separated, since around 2009, they have been co-located in a single purpose-built store, which is now part of the National Museum's Collection Centre. This enables them to be physically compared and has allowed reassembly through photographs, creating a fresh appreciation of the rich variety and intergenerational frame of the group. A striking feature of the pieces is the quantity, colour, and variety of women's wear. Among these are the only objects with the direct provenance. 2 linen hoops, a cream satin dress, and a black silk hood which are all initialed for Rachel or RH. Their date and association with Tyninghame makes it almost certain that these items belonged to Rachel Hamilton, younger sister of Thomas, 7th Earl of Haddington. Shown here with her brother Charles when they were around 11 and 13 years old, neither Rachel nor Charles married, and Tyninghame remained one of their family homes. This cream silk dress would have been worn by Rachel when she was in her late 40s. Rachel's garments do two things. They check our assumptions around age, dress, and unmarried women in the 18th century, and they open a door to investigating provenance context. Large houses in the 18th century were rarely occupied by one member of a family and rarely occupied consistently, nor do personal values necessarily translate into objects. What is kept in attics and the backs of wardrobes can have simply been forgotten. Sometimes things are stored because of emotional association or because of material value. In the Tyninghame textiles, we find all three. Rachel has given us our first clue to the provenance, but a majority of the collection dates to the previous generation. And it's here that we first introduced to a matriarchal family. Meet the protagonists. Rachel Hamilton, her sister Grizzy, and her brothers Charles, George, and Thomas were the surviving children of Charles Lord Binning and his wife, Rachel Bailey. It was Rachel Bailey's sister Grizzle, also Grizzy, who received the velvet saddle trimmed with silver. At the time, Grizzy was married, having become Lady Murray of Stanhope in 1710, but she separated from her husband and returned to live with her parents and sister for the rest of her life. In the Bailey family, there are three generations of Grizzle, two of whom were titled Stanhope after marriage, and two Rachels. Prepare to feel a little bit confused. In Charles's family, there are his mother, Helen Hope, and an unmarried sister who may also have remained in regular residence at Tyninghame, and both could feasibly have owned some of the women's wear objects. There are, of course, men in this family, and menswear in the collection, but for a short period in the history of Tyninghame and in relation to the textiles of the Bailey and Hamilton families, they were not the primary actors. Charles Lord Binning and Rachel married in 1717, and the couple lived at Tyninghame through the birth of their first two children, before moving to live with the Baileys in London in 1721. But by 1728, both George Bailey and Lord Binning were in ill health, and in 1731, Lord Binning had been advised to travel to a warmer climate. He refused to go unless the family joined him. So Lady Grizzle and her husband George, aged 66 and 67, Lady Murray, Rachel, and her eldest daughter, referred to as Little Grizzy, joined Lord Binning on a journey across continental Europe to Naples. Most of what we know about the details of this era of the family's life comes from the accounts and correspondence of Lady Grizzle. She is a popular figure in the history of Lothian Scotland. Lady Grizzle organised and oversaw the European trip. Lady Murray described her mother as cheerfully undertaking the task. But to place that into context, the journey is designed as a tour. It takes them around 6 months to make each leg of the journey. During that time, what Lady Grizzle is cheerfully undertaking is the organising of transport, food and beds for family and servants, including a fluctuating number of temporary hire servants. She pays border control taxes and navigates customs searches at almost every city. Grizzle enjoys sightseeing, sends out laundry, commissions garments and bedding, buys supplies, masters regional exchange rates and new languages. She notes everything in her accounts and regularly loses her spectacles. Leslie Abernethy paraphrases a poem written by Lord Binning once they reached Naples, which gives an insightful picture of their family life. Lord Binning complains of being neglected by his wife Rachel, who is too engrossed in her needlework. George Bailey smokes his pipe and laments the loss of his senses. Grizzle dashes up and down, always leaving her spectacles behind. And Grizzy makes tea and gives instructions to the cook in Italian. Little Grizzy, at 13 years old, like Grandmama, is ever busy, has birds and rabbits, cats and messons, and masters 3 to give her lessons. The tour is undertaken with a serious purpose, the failing health of Lord Binning, but the family sees the opportunity to experience what they can, and a central part of this is making purchases of clothing and textiles. The accounts reflect the truth of Lady Murray's assertion that Lady Grizzle's attention and economy reached to the smallest things. There never appeared in her the least air of narrowness. In fact, the purchases made are testament to Grizzle's knowledge of what to buy in which place. The family stock up on linen and lace as they pass through the Netherlands and Belgium. In France, they purchase figured woven silks, and in Italy, focus on damasks and velvet. The accounts invite comparison with extant objects, but when looking at the Tyninghame group, descriptions such as flowered, seen here, are too vague to make direct comparisons, despite the detailed mirror repeat designs seen in many of the Tyninghame textiles, dating them quite firmly to between 1720 and 1732. In 1732, Claire Brown described Western European textile design as undergoing a revolution, so that such patterns would never be again repeated. In Lady Grizzle's accounts, there is no mention of her daughter Rachel's wardrobe or granddaughter Grizzy's. Their expenses would have been covered separately by Lord Binning's finances. However, we know that they would have been making similar purchases because of the items Lady Grizzle occasionally gifts to them. Gifting is an everyday process for Grizzle. Lady Murray asserts that her mother's expenses were for the credit or pleasure of her family and friends, and great trouble she took for their sakes. One example can be seen here with the 14 ells of silk for Mally Mitchell. The Mitchell family were close friends and were helping to look after George and Thomas while their parents were travelling. The Mally referred to here is potentially a girl of a similar age to little Grizzy, and the generosity of the gift not only suggests an outfit for attending a first social season in London, but reflects Lady Grizzle's knowledge that the Mitchell family were secretly in financial difficulties. Grizzle also bulk buys items such as gloves and fans for friends, as well as making prospective purchases as a type of gift currency to be distributed on return home. Going through Lady Grizzle's accounts, it's clear that while she makes generous purchases for herself, they are equalled by purchases for others. She's part of a gift economy, and although less frequent, she does also receive gifts. In December 1732, Lord Binning died in Naples from what was presumably consumption or tuberculosis. The family stayed in Italy until March 1733, and ahead of their departure, Grizzle notes multiple small purchases, such as caps for her grandsons, wig combs, and fans. Among these is a listing for Donna Louisa's blue damask. A memorandum written by Lady Grizzle in 1740 for her grandsons, when they were about to start their own grand tour, suggests the full identity of Donna Louisa. On reaching Naples, Grizzle asks her grandsons, "I only desire you would wait upon Mademoiselle Louise Cagnoni and her sister, wherever they are, and they will make you acquainted with any other of our friends." This comment makes two things clear: that the unusual addition of a name against the purchase was because Donna Louisa was a friend, and also that Grizzle had not kept in contact. Anticipation of never meeting Louisa again, or not being able to reciprocate, is likely to have prompted Grizzle to pay for the item, whether or not it was intended as a gift. The price she pays exactly matches the cost of a similar length of black damask bought the previous month. In the Tyninghame textile group, there is a length of unused blue damask of approximately the correct date. Alongside it are several lengths of black damasks from unpicked dresses, also of approximately the same date. In December 1732, Lady Grizzle had bought black damasks and had a black damask sack dress made, among other black items. These were undoubtedly for mourning wear. The association between the items and the accounts strongly indicates their association with Naples. But there would be two further deaths before 1740, which could potentially account for black silk as well. Lord Binning's father, Thomas, 6th Earl of Haddington, died only 2 years after the Bailey family arrived back in England. in 1735, and George Bailey would die in 1738. The object associations and connections in the accounts point towards the box of textiles that was split during acquisition in 1977 as having belonged to Rachel Bailey, her mother and sister, probably stored at Tyninghame after their return from Europe. They will have stayed at Tyninghame in order to reunite with Rachel's two youngest children, who were left in the care of the 6th Earl. His death in 1735 left the estates to Rachel's son Thomas, who was still at school and under the guardianship of his mother, Lady Grizzle and George Bailey. And so we begin to see possibilities of how a saddle cover, purchased by a family not yet associated with the house, may have made its way to Tyninghame through family removals and female support systems. What I have hopefully introduced here are thoughts around the importance of retaining associations between objects and recovering their use and origins. There are so many stories to be told by the records of the Bailey and Hamilton families, including themes around religious persecution, political power, estate ownership, marital abuse, attempted rape, personal animosity, failed investments, and enduring friendships. One of the strongest themes that I hope has become apparent is the role of women as capable and necessary actors in the system of the elite household. Without their fulfilling the role of an estate manager and household manager, their menfolk would not have been free to act powerfully within the political system. And it was the political system that supported the economic and social profile of upper-class families. Our protagonists were not key actors on a global stage, but they were not sheltered from it either. In the following brief look at objects relating to the next generation, the Bailey and the Hamilton families are placed into a cultural framework beyond Europe. This court mantra, brocaded with gold, dates to the early 1760s. It's extremely small. The wearer would have been under 5 foot tall, and a modern child's mannequin was used to create the display. The proportion does not obviously relate to other garments in the collection group, and it's also a style almost exclusively associated with attendance at St James's Palace in London. The history of Tyninghame has only one significant event in the early 1760s, which may relate to this dress. Mary Lloyd, stepdaughter of Thomas, 7th Earl of Haddington, is married from Tyninghame House to the Earl's cousin, John Leslie, 10th Earl of Rothes. The Earl was 65 at the time and survived this marriage only 4 years. Mary would later remarry Bennet Langton, a friend of the well-known commentator and dictionary author, Dr. Johnson. It's through Mary's natural father that the dress gains a global connection. Her father was Gresham Lloyd, an elusive figure. In archives of the Earls of Haddington, held privately, there is a listing for papers relating to the executory of the Jamaican estates of Gershom Lloyd, late husband of Mary Countess of Haddington, 1750 to 51. Gersham, or Gresham, is a subject for future research. Without having accessed these executory papers, there is no way to know if he was in debt or brought wealth to his widow and inheritance to his daughter. Searching online only reveals that Gershom was tied up with lending to a heavily indebted owner of the Richmond sugar plantation. Researching the provenance context of the Tyninghame textiles makes it clear that subjugated people of colour were part of the everyday lives of the Scottish elite family. Not only through investments and returns, but Mary's second husband, Bennet Langton, was entrusted by Dr. Johnson to pay Francis Barber, his black servant pictured here, an annuity after Johnson's death. But much earlier, in 1727, Mary's future stepfather, Thomas, 7th Earl of Haddington, was painted with his brother Charles and Judy when Thomas and Charles were around 4 and 7. I put John there, sorry. Leslie Abernethy describes Judy as being taken on by the Bailey family alongside a boy or man called Cyrus. This was probably when the family were in London, Bristol or Bath during the few years before their journey to Naples. Abernethy has not found evidence of purchase of Judy and Cyrus, so it's not clear if they were considered as slaves or free servants. The family certainly treated them as they would other servants, with purchases of clothes and paying for their learning to read, as well as Cyrus's healthcare and funeral when he died only 3 years into his employment. Although not directly connected to the Tyninghame textiles, the lives of African diaspora flicker into view through their provenance. Other global lives are even more hidden, though they are directly present through the objects. The Tyninghame group also has 2 textiles, again from the 1760s and probably of Chinese origin. A group of painted lengths, which are part of an unpicked sack dress, and lengths of green satin damask. Chinoiserie was firmly rooted in Rococo visual style by the 1760s, and male commentators associated it with femininity and frivolity in the first half of the century. When compared to others in the Tyninghame group, more than anything, these textiles signify the global cultural shifts of the mid-18th century that were changing everyday lives. Lady Grizzle and her daughters had made direct purchases using personal understanding of materials and making centres to acquire from artisans in Europe. But the next generation were becoming more reliant on second or third-hand knowledge of making. Their sense of luxury and style was increasingly shaped by global trade. No longer seeking luxury at places where they could witness its making, they bought from markets that promoted an imaginary landscape of otherness. Time, dispersal, and changing values have all hidden the origins of the Tyninghame textiles. But by being hidden, they have created new research pathways. Only by being forced to dig wide and deep to gain understanding of their origins, do the stories of people once forgotten, overlooked, or never before valued begin to interconnect. Behind every object, there is a cultural system, and what has hidden knowledge from us in the past is sometimes the most revealing and important lesson we can address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Our next speaker is Helen Wilde, and the title of her talk is The Storrar Coverlet, Revealing a Story of International Trade.
Today, I'm going to be talking about this object. In 2019, National Museum Scotland acquired this rare double weave woolen coverlet, which is woven with the date 1729. The coverlet had been in the possession of descendants of the Storrar family of West Nether Urquhart, Fife, and before that can be traced back to the late 18th century through the ancestors of this family. The coverlet has been known to those interested in Scottish interiors for some time. For many years, it was on loan to the National Trust for Scotland at Falkland Palace. By family tradition, the coverlet was made in Alloa in central Scotland, and in 1997, it was published by the textile historian Vanessa Habib in an article about the so-called Scotch carpets, with the suggestion that it was made by one of the handloom weavers known to be active, making carpets and coverlets in the central belt of Scotland in the early 18th century. It's very tempting to believe that this attractive coverlet is an example of the thriving handloom tradition in eastern Scotland, especially given its well-documented family history, its double weave technique, which was certainly used for later Scotch carpets. But several aspects of the technique, the design, and the form of the coverlet suggest that we need to question this history. In this paper, I'll explore the manufacture and design sources for the coverlet and suggest an alternative history for it, one which will take us on a journey to the furthest edges of Europe and beyond. To begin with, it's worth looking in detail at the coverlet itself. Its size and form indicate that it was made as a cover of some kind, probably for a bed. It measures 66 by 50 inches and has a selvage at each side and a design woven at each end, so it was woven as a single piece intended to be this size, not as part of a continuous length. It's been edged at the top and bottom with blanket stitch in a woolen thread that may be original. The main field is made of a repeating pattern of birds and rosettes arranged between stylized forms of a tree and a flower head. And at each end, you can see the woven date of 1729. The technique is important. It's a double weave, which means that it's made of 2 distinct layers of cloth, one red and one yellow, which swap places to form the design. So a red bird on the front is a yellow bird on the reverse. This particular type of figured double weave is sometimes called a picked up double weave because the design was literally picked up by hand using a wooden stick at each part of the weft. Looking closely at the structure, the red warps and the red wefts are identical 2-ply Z-twist fibres, and the same is true for the yellow warps and the yellow wefts, but there are peculiarities to the technique. Up close, the texture of the red layer appears looser than the yellow, and this is because there are only half the number of red warps as yellow warps, meaning that they're more spaced out. The wefts, however, have the same spacing in both red and yellow layers. So this means that although at first sight the coverlet appears to be reversible, in fact the design is more legible on one side, and you can see from the fading on the front that that's always been used as the front of the textile. It's also clear that the textile has been woven folded in half. So the loom width is half the width of the textile. And on this slide, this shows the very center of the textile here. And you can see there's a slight bulge down the middle, which is where the textile was folded during weaving. So the actual loom width is 25 inches. The historic linking of this coverlet to the Scotch carpet tradition has a lot in its favour in historical terms. From the second half of the 18th century, coarsely woven double weave woolen carpets were manufactured in large quantities in many Scottish weaving centres. They were commonly called Scotch carpets, suggesting that they were exported to England, which is certainly the case. In 1775, Edward Topham, in his Letters from Edinburgh, gave an evocative description of these carpets. He said, "You find them in every house, from the highest to the lowest, as they are calculated to suit the class of people who wish for the convenience of life, but who cannot afford the extravagant prices of Wilton, Axminster, and other more expensive manufactories." And he goes on to discuss the great taste in which these things are designed. Similar double weave woolen floor coverings had been woven elsewhere in Britain, notably Kidderminster and Barnard Castle, and they're sometimes referred to as in-grain carpets, referring to the grain dye or cochineal used for the fast red colours. And in-grain carpets are probably familiar to many American listeners, as this became an important manufacture in North America as well. The manufacture of these carpets was specifically encouraged in Scotland by the Board of Trades and Manufactures, a body founded in 1727 to try and stimulate the Scottish economy. They offered prizes for improvements in the processes and the materials and in weaving technology. And they also had a sample collection of what they called the best Axminster French and Oriental carpets that could be viewed in their Edinburgh offices as inspiration for these native manufactures. By the 1750s, advertisements in the Edinburgh newspapers speak of Scotch carpets as a commonplace product. Manufactures are recorded in many different centres, including Hawick in the Lowlands, Kilmarnock from the 1770s, Stirling, which is very close to Alloa, Dunfermline, as well as Edinburgh itself. And during the 19th century, Kilmarnock and Glasgow came to dominate. Now, as well as carpets, many of these manufacturers were also advertising coverlets. Despite their large-scale production in the 18th and early 19th centuries, very few examples of Scotch carpets survive, and this is surely due to their primary function as floor coverings, which meant that when they were worn out, these textiles would have been discarded, and they were never particularly high status objects. Those fragments which do survive have often done so by chance. For example, a bundle of fragments found in a scullery at Castle Fraser in Aberdeenshire, which probably date to between 1820 and 1840. This is one of those fragments, and you can see that there are two layers, the front and back, and each layer has a stripe in the weft, so that you have a multicoloured effect, even though there's only two different coloured layers, and it has a relatively small repeating design. This is another example from Castle Fraser, and again, it's quite a small repeat with a stripe in the pale coloured weft, but not in the dark colour. And actually the pattern almost resembles a blown up printed cotton pattern, and this is quite common in the Scotch carpet designs. A larger piece survives, which was found at Holyrood Palace in the servant's bedroom, and it was probably installed in the 1850s. Here we have a complete loom width, and since this is in NMS's collection, I was able to examine it in more detail. And you can see once again, there's a stripe in the pale coloured weft, but what's interesting is the warp threads running vertically are quite narrow, and they're worsted tight twist threads, but the weft threads are thicker, and they're woolen threads. And you find this in the descriptions of the technique. Also, the warp threads are very widely spaced so that you see the weft much more than you see the warp. And this seems to be a very common feature of the Scottish carpets. This is another example from Mellestane House. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of the whole thing, but this is a close-up of its surface. And you can see exactly the same features of this narrow, tight twisted warp threads, and then a weft, which is much thicker and more woolly. And in this example, there are lots of different colours in both layers of weft, so it's really a multicoloured textile. This is one of the few examples surviving of what were called imperial carpets, which were not double weave, but triple weave, so you had 3 layers. And they were introduced sort of, I think, from the 1820s. And this example is probably woven on a jacquard loom because of the complexity of the design. So I wonder if I can just, yeah, I'll go back to this slide. So all of these textiles share the features of having this narrow warp with the weft carrying most of the pattern. They also all have a similar quite narrow loom width of 37 inches, which equates to the Scottish L. They're all woven in single width, so they're not woven folded over like the Storrar coverlet. In addition, they have the same number of warps in both layers. So none of these features are shared with the Storrar coverlet. Perhaps the key distinction, though, in manufacturing terms, is that these Scotch carpets of the late 18th and 19th century represent the development of industrial manufacturing in Scotland. They were produced at a large scale for the market. From industrial records, it's clear that most of the Scotch carpets were also made on draw looms, allowing the pattern to be included in the tie-up of the loom, a far quicker process than picking up each row by hand, which was probably what happened with the Storrar coverlet. Another key difference is the bespoke nature of our coverlet. Although Scotch carpets could be made to measure, this was usually done by weaving the required number of strips of a given design, and then potentially stitching on strips of another design for a border. This is in contrast to the Storrar coverlet, which has been woven not only to its specific size, with a different design at each end, but even includes a date, indicating a special design created for a specific purpose. Now, there was, of course, a long tradition of weaving in Scotland before the industrial developments of the 1730s onwards. As the coverlet is dated to just before these developments, could it represent a survival of this longer handloom tradition? We know that many domestic textiles were woven in the lowlands of Scotland, and they appear often in inventories described as things like striped woolen table covers. But once again, those textiles that do survive from this tradition are very different in character. Most Scottish woolens woven in domestic contexts are more in the character of sort of single layer twill woven textiles, similar to the blankets and arrasades that are more well known. In terms of carpets and coverlets, very little survives from this early date. We do have one example of a different type of carpet, a knotted pile carpet, which was made for the Merchant Maidens Hospital, a charitable school for girls, and it's woven with the name of its founder, Mary Erskine. Now, this example is interesting because it shows that even at this early date, something made as a carpet was imitating sort of imported Turkish carpets, and that links it to many of the later Scottish carpets, the later Scotch carpets, which either imitate things like the Axminsters, which the Board of Manufactures provided for them, or imitating printed cottons. On the other hand, the native sort of domestic weaving in Scotland seems to have been restricted to stripes and checks. There's nothing similar to the bird and rosette pattern on the Storrar coverlet. Where we do find similar textiles, though, is in Sweden. Here there exists a well-documented school of double weave production, which, unlike Scotch carpets, was a domestic manufacture made on hand looms. Referred to as dubbelväv or finnväv, indicating their possible origin in Finland, although there could be other explanations for that name. These textiles have survived in large enough quantities to make out some general characteristics. They are woven in 2 colours, usually red and white, black and white, or blue and white, sometimes red and black. They're often of wool, but sometimes, especially in the earlier examples, the pale layer is made of an undyed linen. Also, they seem to be woven on 2 loom widths, often very similar in size, to the Storrar coverlet. So you can see in this example, it's dated 1799 and it has initials on it. And you can see a join down the centre. And this one seems to be two separate widths which have been stitched together. This is another example which has a very similar design of birds and rosettes to what we see on the Storrar coverlet. This one is datable to about 1800 based on its provenance. And again, you can see there's a join down the middle, maybe a stitched join, maybe it was woven in one piece folded over. And here's a comparison of the design. This is a close-up, which seems to suggest that there are less weft threads in the white layer. Again, something which correlates with what we see on the Storrar coverlet. That's why these gaps are opening up in the white layer of the textile. Here is yet another example which has this combination of birds and rosettes. In this case, the birds are obviously peacocks. Here we've got a date of 1787 at the bottom and two pairs of initials. And also we have the IHS monogram of Christ. So there's a religious element to some of these designs. All of these examples come from the Bohuslän region in Sweden, which is here sort of in the west of the country. But these textiles have also been found much further north in Jämtland up here. So this is an example from Jämtland, which again has rosettes, no birds this time. But again, you have this combination of two pairs of initials and a date. And in this example, you can see there's a stripe in the darker coloured weft. So you've got a black and red combined. Similar textiles have also been found in present-day Norway, in Trondheim, which is neighbouring to Jämtland. It was actually part of Sweden during the 17th century. So this is an example from Trondheim. And here again, you have this by now very familiar sort of diagonal pattern in the main field, borders on all sides, and a row of birds along the top. This one is dated 1741, and unusually it's asymmetrical, so the top and bottom are different. There are many more examples, but the ones I've shown you serve to give a context for the type of production represented by the Storrar coverlet. The closest group, I think, are the ones made in Bohuslän in the west of Sweden. These textiles all have a double weave structure, a central woven or stitched join, a repeated design of either birds, geometric shapes, or both, often a date and sometimes initials. The personalised nature of these designs was possible because they were produced domestically on simple hand looms, with the design picked up by hand. The tradition of double weave textiles had a long history in Scandinavia. Although among the very earliest textiles to surface when antiquarian interest in this work began to emerge in the second half of the 19th century was this famous set of 5 weavings from Överhogdal Church in the Härjedalen in the north of Sweden, which is actually the neighbouring province to Jämtland. They have been carbon-14 dated to between 800 and 1100. They were made during the Viking Age. 4 of the textiles, the ones on the left, are Sumac Weaves, which is similar to tapestry, but the one on the right is a wool and linen double cloth with a geometric design incorporating birds and rosettes. Found in Gudinga Church, this is one of the most famous early Scandinavian double weaves of the slightly later phase. This has been carbon dated to between 1200 and 1349. Here, the distinctive design of lions, griffins, and eagles clearly recalls Byzantine and Islamic textiles. It's also very similar to a textile that's been found in St. Martin's Church in Finland. Now, in this period and later, many church inventories and domestic inventories include textiles described as Finnish weave or Finnish hangings, and also sometimes described as Russian. These were almost certainly the double weave fabrics. There are many, for example, in Stockholm Castle in the 16th century, and they also frequently appear in churches. This textile from Rotterdamla Church is one of the earliest formulations of the coverlet form that we've encountered in the 18th century. It comes from the Värmland area in west central Sweden, so further south than the other examples we've seen. It also has a similar structure, being pieced together from 2 loom widths, and is very similar in size to the Storrar coverlet. This would have had a loom width of 23 inches, whereas our coverlet has a width of 25 inches. Scholars have long been aware that the designs on these early Swedish textiles show the influence of the imported silks that found their way to Scandinavian lands during the Viking period and later. Archaeological evidence shows that silks from as far afield as China, but also Persia, the Byzantine Empire in southern Europe, reached Scandinavia in significant numbers from the late 7th century onwards. These textiles were clearly highly valued and traded. Today, early silks are found in archaeological contexts, where they're often mere fragments, mainly in the southern part of Sweden and Norway and in Denmark, but they're also found in churches. These are some of the most famous examples found in the tomb of King Canute in Odense Cathedral. Most striking for our purposes is the yellow silk, which is probably from the region of Samarkand and is datable to around 900. The birds on this silk may be peacocks, and the cross is a symbol with a cross or a tree of life in between them. These frequently appear in Persian silks, but also in Christian art, and the peacock was a symbol of resurrection, so they appear often in these contexts. In the Swedish textiles, they may still have this religious function. Together, the evidence of the Swedish double weave and their design types presents a picture of a strong weaving tradition stretching back to the Viking era and continuing unbroken into the 18th century. But how did this textile find its way into the possession of a family in eastern Scotland? It may well, as many of the Swedish examples do, celebrate a marriage, hence the date 1729. And the fact that it's been handed down to the female line in the Scottish family could reflect something of this tradition. The Storrar family, who've owned the textile, can only be traced back as far as a marriage in 1787 or 8, which is commemorated in this lintel, which is still attached to their house in Strathmiglo in Fife. Beyond this, we can't trace their family. However, there are many ways that a family such as this could have had a connection to Sweden in the early 18th century. This is where Strathmiglo is in Fife, just here in the east of Scotland. From the 16th century, Scots increasingly travelled abroad as mercenary soldiers, and they famously played a key role in the wars of Gustav Vasa, King of Sweden, during the 30 Years' War in the mid-17th century. By some accounts, some 40,000 Scottish soldiers were in Sweden at this date, many of them marrying and settling in the country. At the same time, many Scots travelled to Sweden as diplomats, agents, and merchants. There were many Scottish traders in other parts of Scandinavia too. After Sweden took over the southern region of Skåne from Denmark at the end of the 17th century, many Scots settled here. And there were further influxes during the early 18th century after the Jacobite risings, when Jacobite immigrants often fled and moved to Sweden. Any of these events could have provided the opportunity for a marriage that perhaps took place in Sweden or a gift from overseas. A recent research project at St Andrews University on Scots in Scandinavia between 1580 and 1707 reveals many families with names who could be linked to this coverlet. Hopefully, further research will allow this story to unfold, but for now, we are very happy to have this Swedish immigrant in Edinburgh and the stories of international trade and exchange that it embodies. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Eileen McKiernan Gonzalez, and the title of her talk is Post-Coloniality, Historicity, and the Environment at the Venice Biennale.
As I consider artists' poignant views of memory of land and culture lost, I acknowledge that in Berea, Kentucky, I speak from the traditional and ancestral lands of the Shawnee and Eastern Band Cherokee nations. I began a project on globalization a few years ago as my teaching and research focus shifted to the experience of artists' travel and engagement across the global South. I was thinking of displacement and exchange in a broader sense and used the continually expanding global networks of biennials as an avenue of approach. I was fortunate to gain funding to explore a series of biennials across the global South and North Atlantic, from Sao Paulo to Dakar, Venice to Shanghai. Venice was the starting and ending point of 2 years of biennial visits, which I'm still processing. I was interested in thematic trends and found trends in issues of displacement of peoples, governmental abuse, indigenous rights, and environmental activism, which clearly came through these visits in a variety of the biennials. I also started noting the expanding presence of fiber artists within these curated experiences. The last of the biennials I visited, as I noted, was the Venice Biennial last year. I was intrigued by the strong presence of textiles, both by artists whose training focuses on fibers and by multimedia artists looking at consumer culture, connectivity, trade, and more. Some examples of the many I have before you. Here, the possibilities of created environments, of fashion, of material culture are clearly articulated in a myriad of ways, both in the curated arsenale and in national pavilions. I was captivated by 4 artists whose work considered loss, in particular, loss through time, colonial experience, and environmental devastation. I would like to acknowledge that where I was in my thinking at the time of writing my abstract to today, much has changed, as has my focus, an aspect of being at the beginning of a research project. The 4 artists whose work connected to my interest in memory and loss were Christine and Margaret Wertheim, Zahra Al-Ghamdi, and Joël Andriano Mearisoa. The environments that these artists created fully immersed me in their imagined spaces, and I thought their use of everyday materials, yarn, leather and felt, and paper connected them to the mundane and community in intriguing ways. In the end, it is Al-Ghamdi and Adriano Mearisoa whose works I will focus on today. Though let me briefly mention the Crochet Coral Reef Project, an ongoing collective project that seeks to bring mathematical knowledge, collective action, and awareness of the bleaching of coral reefs to the forefront. The iteration of the ongoing project of the Venice Biennial was a fraction of prior forms and incorporated into the crocheted coral-like forms discarded elements such as soda can bottles that you can see in the lower corner on your screen. The mathematical sequences were more present than in prior explorations, as was a long climbing spiral reaching the entirety of the space to the ceiling, and you can see that over here, highlighted. The low light of this room was similar to those of Al-Ghamdi and Adriano Mearisoa, establishing a liminal space and experience of the objects. The Crochet Coral Reef project is ongoing, and more information can be found on their website and in TED Talks and other media. As noted, Al-Ghamdi and Adriano Mearisoa each created evocative spaces and speak to poetry in their presentations and statements. Each build their exhibitions from repeated iterations of small handmade objects. Walking through these had very different physical effects, a kind of floating in after illusion and a disquieting effect in I Have Forgotten the Night. Saudi artist Zahra Al-Ghamdi is known as a land artist who has worked on ancestral area of Al-Siri. Trained in Islamic arts at King Abdulaziz University and in contemporary craft at the University of Coventry, her focus on place and memory has had varied applications, mostly with earth and fiber. She notes on her website, quote, "My artwork reflects the memory of past traditional architecture from Southwestern Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to explore this memory with emphasis on poetics." In the curatorial statement, the artist referenced both the region of Al-Siri and Al-Baha in particular includes the reference to pre-Islamic poet Zuhair bin Abi Sulma. The 6th century poet describes returning after 20 years to his home and that of his beloved and encountering a desolate, destroyed, and abandoned place. The poet uses his imagination and small remnants of objects to identify the location of her house. He notes, "Does the blackened ruin, situated in the stony ground between Duraj and Mutathalam, which did not speak to me when addressed, belong to the abode of Umi Aufa? With some efforts, I know her abode again after thinking a while. I recognize the 3 stones blackened by fire at the place where the kettle used to be placed at night, and the trench round the encampment, which had not burst, with the source of a pool. Zuhair describes place, material culture, behavior, and the divine in his poem after decades of infighting and the path that has led him to return. Al-Ghamdi's grandfather was a sheep herder, and she recounts accompanying him in his work, which connects to the materials that she chooses for this exhibit. Excuse me. The telltale signs of sheep passing, of textiles worn, and leaving a presence in space is also described in Zuhair's poem, an allusion to women traversing space. His description continues, as if the pieces of dyed wool, which they left in every place in which they halted, were the seeds of nightshade which had not been crushed. After allusion captures both the sense of an ethereal landscape with the materiality of leather and wool, crafted in traditional manner, boiled and formed and stitched. Al-Ghamdi created between 50 and 52,000 individually crafted objects to form the space, many sitting like rubble, yet evoking growth at the same time. My initial impression was coral, growing forms climbing the walls of the structured cloth, formed like the towers of the Al-Siri region. Zahra Al-Ghamdi, as a land artist, has created on this landscape and the crumbling structures left behind for the modernity of highways and skyscrapers. And I have on this image 2 of her earlier works. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but 2 of her earlier works that use fiber and earth. And then below, a couple of the images that are reference points to this region, to Al-Baha, and also to the traditional arts that she speaks about in her writing as Al-Siri ornaments that were mostly associated with women's work in terms of painting households and in textile works. And so calling to mind both of those in these works. Using techniques found in shoemaking, leather pouches, and jewelry, the vessels appear both created and organic, abandoned and alive. The massive dim hall had light emanating from the lit towers, and viewers around me initially expressed a kind of awe and delight over the effects of the tiny objects and the constructed space. Like Zahra Al-Ghamdi, Joel Andriano Meadisoa evokes a time and space lost. The language of his interviews, curatorial statements, and prior works connect to the past and the loss and struggle of displacement. As with Al-Ghamdi, Andriano Meadisoa began his training in Madagascar at home at the Institut Métiers Arts Plastiques in Antananarivo, then completed his degree at the École Spéciale d'Architecture in Paris in 1993. While his degree is in architecture, his graduation project and work since has centered on fiber works and moving into paper more recently, and he has had a strong presence in biennials over the last decade. His participation in the Venice Biennial marked the first of a Madagascar pavilion, so he's the inaugural Madagascar artist. In the exhibit, I have forgotten the night, the distant memory of the sky, but also of lives and pages of love and loss communicated, construct a space that overwhelms upon entry. Due to my own history, the leaves that are bound seem like bodies hanging together, archival and damaged through the hanging, and yet also the night sky through the deep black of the clustered pages. The curatorial statement emphasizes a place no longer vibrant. The palace of Ilafi, the first royal residence of the 12th sacred hill of Imerina. And what I'm showing you here is the rova or palace that is there surviving that replaces the ancient one, and some of the ruins and then the hills that you can see in the distance. As with his series of textile works last year in Antananarivo, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, Created through the use of sari material, a recognition of the close connections with South Asia culturally, he celebrates a series of powerful women, including, and this is the image, the detailed image that I have here, Rana Valona, who was a 19th century female sovereign of Madagascar, whose isolationist and repressive policies attempted to hold off colonialist powers. And it's fact after her death that France gains colonial controls over Madagascar. In an interview, Adriano Mearisoa references a ball during French occupation, this image up at the upper left-hand corner on my screen, and notes the cultural dynamic of Malagasy peoples dressed and behaving as French as a loss, an enforced acculturation. The series has a strong presence of Black, the color Black, as does the Venice Biennial exhibition. In an interview, he goes on to note, when I'm using Black, it's not just a color. Among this, the idea of Black, there are a lot of things from the Black portraitures, from the Black color, from the Black system, from the Black market. So it's a heavy statement on Black, which depends on the culture and on the context too. The language of loss is present in the Black sheets, described as ashes, and the loss of memory. In I Have Forgotten the Night, he references that night that was more beautiful than your days in the quote from Racine that frames the exhibit and all of the documentation associated with it. The poignant sense of loss, the density and multiplicity, repetition of a single form, Black sheets of paper, darkened and unreadable, centers on this lacuna created by loss and no longer able to replicate in memory. The effects culturally and physically of colonial rule are ever present in his work. History, memory, and loss, that beautiful night, memories of love and connections lost in a distant place and time. Both Algamdi and Adriano Mearisoa frame the issues of loss of constructed histories and places deeply enmeshed in contested and fraught histories. Their constructed environments shift the emotive experience of the viewer through the physical aspects of lighting and form. I wanted to, in my abstract, I mentioned the work, so sort of trying to connect back to the abstract. I just wanted to mention, because I noted Ghanaian Alan Tsui's presence in the biennial, I wanted to make sure I included him, the three massive metal multi-wall tapestries that he created for the exhibition. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Aditi Khare. I'm sorry, I didn't ask you how to pronounce your last name. I apologize. However, I'm very much looking forward to your talk, and I'm sure that many people are. The title of her talk is Prejudiced Commodities, Understanding Knowledge Transfer from India to Britain Through Printed and Painted Calicoes, 1720 to 1780.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. As an early career researcher, I'm a PhD candidate. I'm really thankful for my paper being accepted here. Right, so let's get right to it. I would like to begin with an acknowledgement. The University of Alberta, where I am right now, is located in the Amiskwashi-Waskaikan on Treaty 6 territory, which is the territory of the Papuche, the homeland of the Métis Nation. And as such, I recognize our privilege to be able to live and work in a land that is not our own. So today I'll be talking about the role of Indian cotton industry in the global trade and the story of the British Industrial Revolution. As I'm sure most of you know what chintz is, but just really quickly, it's printed and painted cottons that were traded and consumed widely in the early modern period and even before, but Europe's participation in this trade was primarily in the early modern period. And I look at particularly the trade knowledge translating into production knowledge in Europe. And my central argument is that the rise of British calico printing industry was heavily dependent on the skill and knowledge acquired through Chin's trade with India. I will be today, at least, will be looking at the Coromandel region and generally the southern part of India. The purpose of my work today and overall is to look away from Eurocentric narratives and acknowledge Indian systems, the knowledge, the Indian agency of the artisans, and the decentering of the hero moments that are key to Industrial Revolution narrative so far. So really quickly, I'm going to go into the technique of printing just because, well, it's relevant today. So the greatest reason for the popularity of painted and printed calico fabrics in Britain was the wide variety of fast colors which they exhibited. Painted or printed fabric can be produced in several methods involving dyes, mordants, and thickness. The traditionally practiced method in India involved mordant printing or painting, where the mordant was painted onto the fabric in differing strengths or combinations based on the results required and the chemical affinity of the dye. And then mordants react with the dyes in order to form an insoluble coloring substance, which then sticks to the surface of the fabric and the color is fixed. So for varying shades of the same color, the mordant would be combined with the cloth and it would be combined in different concentrations. A large concentration of mordant would generally result in a darker shade of the same dye, and different mordant would react with different pigments to achieve different colors. Once they were all painted into the fabric, it would be dipped into a vat of dye, as you can see the dye are doing here. And the dye solution would take on different colors on the fabric. This process was most commonly used for madder dyeing, which is red, but madder can achieve a wider range of colors, such as black and different shades of brown. Mordants were by no means an Asian introduction to the manufacturing process. They were used in most kinds of textile printing, but what is important to note for our purpose today is that for printing on wool or silk, mostly direct mordants suffice, or basic mordants suffice, which requires a shorter and simpler process. In the case of cotton printing, the combination of different processes and the addition of acids and steam is required as catalysts in order to achieve fast colors. Another common process of printing involves wax resist dyeing, which is implemented to produce goods where the ground was colored and the pattern was white. This involved applying wax or other resist material on the pattern, which would prevent the pattern from getting dyed itself. And then it would, as usual, be dipped in a dye vat, resulting in colored ground and a white pattern where the resist had been applied. Understandably, this process required a cold or a tepid dye vat so that the resist would not melt off. And it was most often used in indigo printing because indigo dye required a separate process from usual pigments. So indigo is a vegetable dye that occurs in an insoluble state. So due to its natural insolubility, indigo required an additional stage of reducing it to a soluble compound called indigo white. Once indigo white exists, it would combine with the cloth and it could be exposed to the air, allowing for reoxidization into the blue color. Now, this meant that the process of printing, if you wanted a blue design on a white ground, was harder because if you applied it with a block or painted it on, it would immediately be exposed to the air, be reoxidized, and would form the blue color but insoluble compound, which could not stick to the fabric. The other problem that Europe faced while trying to convert this process was that they required cold or tepid vats, but they couldn't do that because traditionally the blue had been dyed in Europe with the substance woad, which requires hot temperatures along the process. And so there was a transfer of process there as well in trying to adapt indigo and its printing techniques. My work largely stems from Giorgio Riello's idea of the Indian apprenticeship, where he believes that the chintz trade and other kinds of trade, but specifically the chintz trade, was an apprenticeship for European companies to learn 4 different aspects of the commodity. The 4 aspects he looks at is material, technique, taste, and design. I specifically in my work look at 2 aspects, that is design and technique, which comes from my earlier training as a textile designer. And today I'm looking at technique, but in my more current work, I've been looking at design transfer specifically. So what do I speak of when I speak of useful knowledge? I speak of Joel Mockere's definition of useful knowledge, which is knowledge that exists in nature that human beings can interact with. But what is key here that he says that this knowledge only exists when it is transferred by carriers, and it is those carriers that we are looking at today. Historiography has since developed the idea of useful knowledge, and it now points towards artisans as producers of knowledge and products as carriers of knowledge, which is largely my methodological idea. So we know that calico or chintz produced a lot of changes in taste, design, and the general consumption culture in Europe. It also led to several Calico Acts, but in Britain specifically, it led to 2 Calico Acts, which initially banned the import and then the consumption of chintz. So the East India House. So the company records after 1721, which is the second Calico Act, contain drastically fewer references to chintz and instead show a rise in the import of plain white calicos into Britain. This indication of import of plain white calicos shows that there was an influx of plain raw material into Britain, which required printing, or at least was being consumed for printing. This shift also coincides with the increased institutionalization and incentivization for in calico printing techniques. So while the other example, so there's kind of a contrast between Britain and France. Britain and France both banned calicos near about the same time, and both resulted in greater discussion surrounding chintz. But the French example shows that while the prohibition in France was more restrictive, the debate surrounding the repeal of these acts in 1759 generated discussion surrounding free trade. And in order to prove that France would be able to sustain its industry in the face of competition from Asian fabrics, the stakeholders arguing for free trade and liberalism took concentrated measures to equip their industry and state with manufacturing knowledge on chintz. This led to specific institutionalization, such as the Bureau de Commerce, which was responsible for collecting manufacturing knowledge. They did this by industrial espionage, centers of manufacture, accumulation of codified knowledge, and encouraging skilled migration, which resulted in 5 codified documents that describe the process of Indian chintz printing and painting. Those 5 French documents are quite possibly the only known codified documents that exist on the matter. There is lesser codified collection from the side of English East India Company officially, since the English expansionist mercantile ideologies were at odds with the manufacturing knowledge. But even so, we can see quite a few tacit carriers of knowledge. Tacit, I mean that knowledge that was not codified or written down, but was carried through people or objects. Some of the categories we'll be looking at right now are merchants, artisans, English East India Company officers that add to the category of practical useful knowledge, which is often unsystematic and informal, passed down vertically from master to apprentice or horizontally between agents. The first thing we're looking at is East India Company men. There were some communications to London about a certain Robert Young, who was overseeing indigo calico trade in Agra, which said, "We have sent your worships by Robert Young musters of such sorts of cloths as are to be had in Agra in quantities." The sorts are numbered from A to F with their contents, names, and prices written on their papers and are bound and sealed up in 6 bundles. I want to reiterate here, the classifications of these textiles by Robert Young was only possible because his knowledge of the quality, prices, and types of chins, which he had acquired through trading interactions during the course of his work in India. Largely unintentionally, these samples, as well as the East India Company men carrying or dealing with them, became carriers of tacit knowledge, which provided Britain's textile industry with an epistemic base on which to build a new commercial product. The second category we're looking at is East India Company men and brokers. So the communication between the East India Company men and brokers was largely punctuated by the middlemen who were key Indian merchants who acted as brokers. The company records mention several instances where relations between brokers and company officials were tumultuous. However, reading the same records against the grain would tell us also that there was regular communication between these officers and Indian merchants, and that this communication, or lack thereof, was about quality control and design deliverables. For instance, the Council of Madras noted in 1745 that the factors settled in Visakhapatnam had no protection or subordinate brokers and had to therefore procure goods themselves from the manufacturer. So here we're looking at direct contact. Another example is the East India Company factories as centers of contact. So through the 17th and 18th century, the East India Company established factories in India intended as centers for trade. The main factories were established in Surat, Bombay, which is now Mumbai, Madras and Calcutta, which is now Kolkata, all of which were major ports. The subordinate factories, however, were established either along overland trade routes or near production centers that allowed for supervision and quality control. K.N. Chaudhary has suggested that the East India Company was not establishing centers of production. They were assessing existing centers for merits and advantages, which resulted in the establishment and abandonment of several subordinate factories as production centers shifted. This flux of movement and establishment of new factories indicates a continuing discussion surrounding the commercial merits of chins, standardization, finishing, and design quality. Now we look at, there are a few records of direct transfer of the English East India Company men trying directly to engage with chins manufacture and patronage. I've only uncovered this to a small extent. They're really hard to find. So one of them is Thomas Pitt, the governor of the Madras factory, said in a letter to London in 1700, "I have with all diligence encouraged the painting trade and have been at some charge to do it. Without any manner of partiality, I think we far outdo Masulipatam and hope by the next ship to send you 1,000 pieces such as never were seen in the world. If I can but keep these cursed fellows from mixing the southern che, which is a material used for red dye, with the northern, the latter being the best and costs much more." So here he was presumably talking about cotton printers that were encouraged to settle at the company factory in Madras. This statement indicates his awareness regarding new materials, raw materials, application processes, and its implications on the quality of the product. It is an excellent example of direct transfer of tacit knowledge acquired through trade interests and eventually manifesting itself in the design of the products. There exist other records of possible production in the East India Company factories. In 1734, Surat weavers faced instability and were invited to the company factory in Bombay to set up production. Whereas much earlier records from Surat in 1647 mention a dyeing house within the factory with 36 wards dedicated to dyeing calicoes exported to Britain. Then, of course, there's travelers' accounts. Several travel accounts codified and distributed trade knowledge. As such, they contain some knowledge about textile production in varying degrees. The most accounts contain a basic level of information, which would be essential for any merchant or trader. One such example is Jean-Baptiste Tavernier in the late 17th century, and he said, They make same sort of calicoes in other countries as well as Sarange, but the colors are not so lively. Besides that, they wear out often washing, whereas those that are made at Sarange, the more you wash them, the fairer the colors show. This was a key identification of good chintz. There runs a river by the city, the water whereof has that virtue that it gives the beauty and liveliness to the colors. And while the rains fall, the workmen will make these prints upon their cotton according to patterns which foreign merchants give them. For when the waters are seized, the water is thicker, and oftener they dip their calicoes, the better the colors hold. So this shows a keen interest not only in the trade of the industry, but also an attempt at understanding the chemical workings of the durable colors that had rarely been seen in Britain. Other traces are buried in codified texts produced in the 18th century. For instance, in 1705, a volume titled The Whole Art of Dyeing in Two Parts, printed in Germany, France, and England, credits England's excellence in manufacturing to skilled immigrants who would then distribute their choicest secrets amongst us English manufacturers. Another example is a certain John Henry Schaeffer wrote to the Royal Society of Arts in 1757, applying for an award which required applicants to make the discovery of giving such a red color to cotton and linen yarn as should be found equal to the yarn dyed in the East Indies. In another letter to the RSA in 1756, the author says, a beautiful red color to stain the linen and cotton, I believe, is wanting, the Indians alone having had hitherto this secret. For those reds which are made use of here and in other parts of Europe are all boiled in with madder and require long bleaching, and I believe are not so beautiful as the India. Therefore, a lasting red that could be laid on linen or cotton with a pencil to fill up flowers would be of great use to the manufacturers. This is exactly the process of chintz. As calicoes printed here would then outdo Indian chintzes in color as they do now in pattern. So the production and consumption of chintz was part of a structural power imbalance in the early modern period. This was manifested through an encounter, interpretation, and reappropriation process exercised in the active commodification of chintz, its production, and its design. Further, seminal Eurocentric scholarship in the 20th century has reinforced the categorization of European superiority by attributing innovation and authentic visual aesthetic to Eurocentric narratives. My hope here is to bring to light both intentional and unintentional acts of reappropriation in order to produce a more nuanced picture. Like I said, I'm currently looking at developments of the Indian design aesthetic in global chintz in the 18th century by analyzing older Indian textiles and colonial botanical sources from both the 17th and 18th centuries. It's a really potentially developing subject, and I would appreciate any feedback, ideas, or research questions on this one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aditi. And if all our presenters could turn their audio and video back on so we can see you, that'd be great. Welcome back. Thank you so much for that fantastic really kind of journey around the world in discussing global trade. I thoroughly enjoyed every bit of it, and I'm sure that everyone else did too. So I will start reading off some questions we have here. Emily, people were confused and thought you were Helen, as you probably thought might happen. So there is a question for you, Emily, about have you found any embroideries from the women of the households that you discussed in the collection?
To my knowledge, we don't have any in our National Museum collection. But a lot of objects that belong to these women I was discussing are still held by the family at Mellestane House. So Mellestane's not that far away from Tyninghame that I was talking about. And the Earl of Haddington still owns that property, and they have it open to the public through summer months, normally, obviously not this year. So you can have a look online, because they have put out small publications and they have a Facebook page. So you might occasionally see some of the objects that they still have in their collection on those spaces. So.
Thank you. Another question about your presentation. Do we know whether the Lloyds are related to the Lloyds of the state of Maryland, of the largest, if not the largest slave owners in the state of Maryland?
I don't know. So my cursory searches around this character, I only really found one mention of him online, and I just can't seem to find anything that seems to be specifically him. So essentially, that needs more research. If anyone's better at that research, I'd love to hear from them. He died, we think he probably died in around 1748 or 49. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Mary remarries the Earl of Haddington in 1750. So we're not quite sure where Gershom was, if he was in Jamaica or if he was in Britain. So yeah, further work, but I haven't personally found anything yet.
Thank you. And I think the next question must be for Helen. Would American colonists in the 1700s have purchased or brought over the Scottish blankets or carpets?
That's a really interesting question, and I'd hope to be able to talk about the Scottish, the American coverlet tradition, but I didn't have the time. So definitely Scots emigrating to North America did bring textiles with them and textile skills. And that's best recorded, to my knowledge, in things like sampler making, because we have the identities and you can trace people through that. In terms of coverlet weaving, there's a tradition that the North American coverlet weaving school originated in Scotland, and that's repeated often. But when people have tried to investigate this, it's very hard to actually find links. And in particular, the North American coverlets, which are often double weave textiles, there's nothing like them in Scotland at all. They're actually more similar to things called Welsh blankets, which are also double weave sort of textiles, woolen, with these geometric sort of like optical illusion designs. But yeah, people have looked into this connection with Scotland, and although a lot of Scottish weavers did come to Canada and North America, and there's records of them weaving in domestic settings, it seems that the early ones were weaving like simple woolens, and it's not clear where this North American double weave tradition came from, but possibly it could have come with Scandinavian immigrants, as there are areas where their presence was very strong. And I don't know whether that's ever been explored, but that's much more likely because there isn't really a tradition of domestic double weave production in Scotland.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you very much. Yeah, certainly the American coverlets appear very similar to the one that you showed us today. A question for Aditi. Have you done any research on the re-exportation of chintz from India via Europe to West Africa?
Yeah, there's just so much to do. I have done some cursory research into re-exportation, but I only know the very basics. Now that I am here in North America, I'm looking to trace the network of chintz to both Canada, what is now Canada, and the USA, and or Africa, of course, as well. But no, I've only done very cursory work in that.
Yeah, those global markets are just immense for the Indian textiles. I don't see any more questions here, but I have some. Eileen, I wonder if you could talk a bit, and I know you only briefly touched on the work of El Anatsui, so I'm just going to assume that you have lots more knowledge about that. But you tell me if I'm wrong. I wonder if you could talk about his work falling into the category of textile and the use of the word tapestry, for instance, to describe the large hangings, because there's, you know, some people want to say they're textiles, we want to claim them, and others not. So,
and I think it's complicated by the fact that his early work is not actually in textiles, but in woodwork, and so I tend to, because his references are often about cloth, and the way that they're staged is very deliberately to create cloth and movement, and so he has a very specific armature behind the works that are meant to create those folds to suggest that kind of movement. And he talks about royal cloth used, and so he's using these discarded objects that from things like beer bottles, the metal things at the top that close them, and shaping them and in a kind of workshop model to do that, and then building up, sort of stitching them together. He's using metal to do that, wire to stitch together. And so in that stitching, it has that quality of cloth. And I tend to privilege what artist intention is when I think about these things, and the way he tends to address them is about cloth. And the fact that these are coming from metal objects that are being reclaimed and transformed into threads, metallic threads. That's part of why I include him under that category.
Yeah, no, and many people do, and I think your comment about the artist's intention really, that kind of puts it, for me, that sort of puts it to rest. So thank you very much for that. Let's see, I have a comment. Oh, here we go. Having known El Anatsui for a long time and working on textiles in the youth-speaking Ghana where he grew up, is that he is weary on many claims being made between Kente and his work.
Well,
so
yeah. I will privilege the speaker in that it is a reference, the flowiness of the cloth. I didn't use the word Kente for that reason, but the language of cloth, certainly.
We have compliments from Madeline Shaw, another great session, excellent papers all. I actually have, let's see, another question that's just popped up. Yes, Aditi, what range of textiles were produced at the East India factories, the 4 that you mentioned, and what processes of these textiles took place at the factories?
So the word factories is kind of a misnomer. They weren't really producing much at these factories, which is why in my work I've picked at the very specific instances where they actually do mention some kind of production. Generally, these factories were just centers where you could bring in the material that was supposed to be traded out, assemble it, do quality checks, classify it as to different kind of locations and purposes that it was going out for, and then send it out. So they were almost like trading headquarters of the East India Company in different regions. And there are very rare instances that any production was happening there. I mentioned a few which I found, but there's not a whole lot of production happening there.
Right. I think we can categorize the production really as a kind of cottage industry with regions, and then the so-called factories are, yes, as you say, the points of gathering and distribution.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know it's a very misleading word, but it's been used for, I think.
Yeah. It's what they used as well.
Term. Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah. So thank you. Question from Madeline Shaw for Helen and Emily. Have you found many divided collections in the NMS that have come out of the Royal Scottish and Museum of Antiquities? Such an interesting research odyssey, she says.
Actually, off the top of my head, I can't think of any others that were split. Obviously, in this way, we do have. There was a lot of sharing. So between Helen Bennett was the curator at NMAS, the Antiquities Museum, and I think she had quite a good relationship with Naomi Tarrant. And I think they did talk to each other quite a lot, and I think collections were kind of combined. So obviously, a really common thing in museums is that you have limited funds for acquisitions and limited space for storage. So I think in the late 70s and through the early 80s, I think there was a lot of conversation between two institutions. Undoubtedly, there will be other collections that have that split and have then been rejoined when the museums were amalgamated. But I can't think of any specific ones just off the top of my head.
But in a more general sense, there are collections of types of object, most obviously our tartan collections, which have developed in parallel over a really long period of time, but they've never been looked at together until the last 2 years. We now have a research post, somebody actually looking at that collection as a whole. And it's very interesting because some things have been collected from a sort of antiquarian history point of view and others from a sort of design point of view. They've been treated very differently and catalogued very differently. And it's only now that I think we're understanding the importance of the collection by looking at it as one thing. And I think there's many other areas where that will be the case, like linen damask is another one we're starting to look at. So
that's very exciting. Some job security there. Okay. I have another question for Eileen. In the Biennale, there are multiple pieces, many times smaller pieces, to compose an installation. Can you talk about how it is different to make a single art piece as opposed to a piece of many parts, or what your thoughts are about this?
That might be a good question for an artist as opposed to an art historian, but I think, well, if I sort of think of Zahra Gamdi, that since the exhibition, she's had portions of it exhibited elsewhere in the same way as the Wertheim sisters. Sometimes there's the fullness of a massive piece, and then there's excerpts, in essence, from them. I think it goes back to, so I've not seen Al-Ghamdi's work exhibited ever with just a singular piece, right? It is intended as that multiplicity of objects that are built up to create an environment. And so in some ways it's the difference between a series and a singular work with many parts. And it goes back to the intent within this. And here, without those small leather vessels, those sheets, in essence, lose the quality of it, right? So it needs those pieces, and the pieces alone don't have that architectural kind of feeling of walking through ruins or passing through a landscape. And so I think that they're intimately connected in her work. In other installation type works, sometimes we see artists pulling from a variety of different series that they've worked at over time, depending on how much space they've been given in a biennial. And both Adriano Merisoa and Al-Ghamdi's work were national pavilions where they had a massive space to fill. And I think that also has an effect on how artists approach a space. I listened to Margaret Wertheim's TED Talk, and one of the things she talks about is the moment where suddenly she's accepted to do an exhibition in 3,000 square feet space, and tells her sister, who's actually the artist, as opposed to a mathematician, and her sister immediately understands what has been asked of them in ways that she was like, sure, we could do that, and so I think that's an aspect of it. What is the space that you're working with? And the whole of it is considered a single piece, as opposed to a thematic exhibition with multiple works with a similar theme. And I think that's kind of what it comes back down to. I hope I answered the question.
You did for me. Thank you. I have another question for Helen from Amelia Peck. The birds in your coverlet are quite like American coverlets by weavers of German and Dutch backgrounds. Have you traced the double cloth tradition to other parts of Northern Europe?
I haven't, although the wording of some of the Swedish inventories could suggest, as I mentioned, possibly that these things were used in Finland and in Russia, but I haven't looked in detail at that, so I will follow it up. But what I would say is that those designs, although originally I think they arrived in Scandinavia through the import of textiles, from the 16th century onwards, you have printed pattern books with designs for textiles, especially for embroidery, which include the birds, the peacocks, the rosettes, very, very similar forms, which are set out in sort of grid patterns for use in different kinds of textiles. And through those pattern books, the designs were disseminated throughout Europe. And you find them specifically, for example, in samplers in the Netherlands and Germany, as well as in Britain. So that's one way from the 16th century onwards that those designs, which originate in the earlier textiles, were then disseminated and much more widely available, and you find them in a lot of different contexts from then onwards. But I will follow up the Dutch and German lead, because it's still unclear where the double weave coverlet tradition in North America actually came from. So that's a good tip. Thank you, Amelia.
Thank you. Eileen, I'm just going to draw your attention to the chat, actually. Malika, who had the comment about El Anatsui, sort of expands on her comment to you personally.
It is one of those, especially with an artist who's gotten so much prominence. I didn't see it as an attack, though.
No,
Malika at all. It becomes a kind of, his work has been so prominent and is in so many collections now that I think there is a lot of the removal of subtleties within it, and also in looking at a work outside of its context, that because he has worked so much in Nigeria, that a lot of the things associated with where he's worked versus where he's come from, and those cultural divides are often glossed over. And so I think it's a very good point that Malika made.
Thank you. And probably my reading of it off the top of my head as I was trying to read it and sort of double tasking, I may have also implied or made it sound negative. So I apologize for that to both of you. A question from Madeline Shaw about the tartan researcher who is working in Edinburgh. Is it Rosie Wayne?
It is indeed Rosie Wayne. We're very lucky to have her.
Such a lovely, small little world we live in. Aditi, I'm going to ask you another question that this is, a huge topic, but I just wonder if you've thought about the difference between the British East India Company and the French strategies and their end goals. It seems to me, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Liza Oliver, who has, I'll have to send you her, actually I can type it into the comments. My impression is that the French are much more interested in knowledge for its own sake, in addition to producing, printing, and the British are more interested in making things in a very general way.
Yeah, in terms of, it's part of my research, but obviously for the purpose of this paper, I didn't include it. But even the structures of accumulation of knowledge were very different. In the British context, it was very individual driven. So if a person was interested in knowledge for knowledge's sake, they would go out and get it. But in the French case, at least in the case of textiles, it was very sort of centralized top-down approach. And so it's common knowledge at this point, but Colbert worked towards accumulation of knowledge, and his policies were towards accumulation of knowledge. So even within the institutions, as much as the trading companies, it is reflected that there was just a lot of centralization of knowledge for the sake of using it afterwards. So yes, there is quite a basic difference in French and English policies there.
I'm just typing in this title to the chat so everyone can see it. What year was it published? And I'll just read it out while we're here. It's again Liza Oliver. She's a professor at Wellesley. Art, Trade, and Imperialism in Early Modern French India. It's Amsterdam University Press. Someone has typed in a question about French espionage, which you mentioned, before or after the French Revolution.
Both, really. The thing is that there were a few select immigrants working in different parts of Europe with their own sort of knowledge, with their own sort of setups and industries. And so there was a lot of espionage in trying to get the knowledge of those select systems and those select immigrants. And it just it continued.
Yes. What is the name of the Englishman who moved to France? He has a famous manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale. It's like a textile history. Helen, you look like it's on the tip of your... I can't think of it now. All right. I'm going to stop frustrating you with things that I can't think of. I'll send it to you.
Some of his archive is...
Walter, yes, Linda Eaton. Thank you, Linda. I knew someone would know. Yes, another question from an audience member. Helen, wonderful presentation. Do you know what dyes were used in the Storrar coverlet, and how much is known about dyes used in Scotland at the time?
Yes, we did dye analysis, and the red is a madder dye, and the yellow is Wyld with a little bit of indigo. And those dyes are found in some of the Swedish coverlets that have been tested, but the earlier ones, I don't know about the 18th century ones. For Scottish textiles in the 18th century, quite a lot of work has been done by Anita Coy and Hugh Cheap on the dyes in tartans. And it's been discovered that it was always assumed that, these are rural textiles using, local lichens for the dyes, but actually from quite early, you had imported dye stuffs, indigo and cochineal being used for tartans being made in the Highlands and the Western Isles. And then from the mid 18th century, you start having more investigations into new dye stuffs. And that was one of the things that the Board of Manufacturers and Trade was trying to promote, was better dyeing processes and dye stuffs. So there's a sort of shift in the mid 18th century that things get more standardized. Quite a lot is known. The Scotch carpets, so few survive that we don't know what dyes we use, but for the red dyes, as I said, they were called in-grain carpets, which suggests that the cochineal dye was used, but some of them distinguish between scarlet and crimson, as they were obviously using two different red dyes, and some of the accounts, like the manufacturers' advertisements, talk about grain carpets and half-grain carpets, as if that was distinguishing between what kind of red dyes we use. So it was obviously part of the marketing and the pricing of them, was which dyes were being used to produce them, once things became sort of more industrialized.
Thank you. Aditi, I have another question for you. Were there any 18th century textiles exported to Europe which also contained red silk, red in parentheses, so I guess silk or specifically red silk?
Yes,
thank you.
Both of them. Red specifically was the color or the technique, you want to call it turkey red, was really popular, and there was the idea that if you could only crack how to print turkey red, you had a gold mine and you could print chintz. And so yes, there was a lot of export of red textiles. About silk, I don't know if specifically red silk was a thing, but silk definitely was, just from attending this symposium over the past 2 days. I've learned more about silk production, especially in Eastern India, that was then exported, which I think started with China, but India had its own production centers that were then exported to Europe. And there's a lot of products such as banyans, which were specifically most often made in silk. And so definitely there was a network there.
Oh, we're getting thanks. So if we don't have any more questions, I think we can give people perhaps a little bit more of a break for those of you who are going on to the next sessions. A huge, sincere thank you to all of you for your presentations and for coming to us at different times of day and night. And we wish you all very well. It was great to see all of you.